I remember growing up during very turbulent times and not really understanding whether my family was financially lower or higher in the pecking order for quite a while. All the way to my teens, I always felt like we have a bit less than a lot of people in our community and a lot less than the families I saw depicted on TV. As I moved into high school, our standards started to slowly rise. I was getting a yes to more and more requests for toys, video games, or comics. The family car got much more spacious, and we finally moved into a flat of our own, instead of occupying the same place as my well meaning but sometimes understandably annoying grandparents. I remember that as the first time when I heard my parents say that we are now a middle-class family. That altered my perspective strongly, gave me more confidence and a sense of stability, both knowing my parents will be okay, but also, selfishly, that means I might have more opportunities in the future than I originally thought I would. The idea of the middle class, given to me by my parents and to them by the new neoliberal order in my country, left me feeling different, and at times, and even though I was a child, I will still say this with disgust, as superior to families which toiled away in far more physical and underpaid professions. I had completely bought into the idea of the middle class, and through that, the notion that we are somehow doing much better than we actually were. That, dear Tavarishi, is what we will be discussing today. Just how many working class people, which my family always was, are tricked into believing illogical fallacies which call themselves class, and how that inherently undermines class consciousness and the struggle towards building solidarity amongst the people on whose backs everything is practically built. Class isn't just about numbers. In the modern context, when discussing class with conservatives or liberals, what you will commonly hear being identified as a class is a person's wealth. This is usually followed by whether they have a college degree or not, their lifestyle, and whether their profession is considered desirable or menial. There's a mythical connotation which suggests that the majority of the population is somewhere in the middle, while the extremely wealthy, and in contrast the working class, are an albeit real but easy to ignore and tiny chunk of society.
Hello friends! So, I was trying to think of a way of describing the sort of culture that I am most attracted to, and here is what I came up with. Middle class.
You keep using the word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
But what is the middle class, you ask? And why do I love it so much? Well, let us do a deep dive. For most of human history, there were basically only two classes, the very rich and the very poor. But then, over the centuries, we went through a number of economic and technological changes, creating a whole bunch of new jobs right in the middle of the income spectrum, which allowed a new sort of lifestyle to emerge, the lifestyle of the middle class. And over the last century or so, the middle class grew huge and basically squeezed the other two classes to the fringe.
Just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in.
The middle class has now grown so big, it has actually developed new classes within itself, like the lower middle class and the upper middle class, as distinguished from what is sometimes called the comfortable middle class.
Just say what we want.
Shut
when
the
you think about
fuck
it.
up!
If we prod, even slightly, at the concept of the middle class as liberals and conservatives define it, it quickly starts to fall apart at its core. For example, you'd probably consider somebody fixing elevators as a pretty working class job, while you'd see a Starbucks manager as lower mid-class of an individual. Well, silly, what if I told you the guy fixing elevators gets over $75K a year in the US, while the manager gets under $45K? Hell, someone running a small shop of their own selling t-shirts next to the seaside, a business owner, probably makes less than the person that fixes these magical flying boxes we call elevators. How much money someone earns can't and doesn't tell you everything. For example, the shop owner, even though she earns less, has the ability to hire fire, and change their employees' salaries at will. Economics professor and author of The Working Class Majority, Michael, and I'm sorry for spelling it out this way, Zweig, explained it this way. By looking only at income or lifestyle, we see the results of class, but not the origins of class. We see how we are different in our possessions, but not how we are related and connected and made different in the process of making what we possess. Simply put, how much we actually have, or how we proceed to live our lives either as Netflix bingers or world travelers, does not define our class. Instead, it's defined first and foremost through how we earn our bread, how we create our lifestyles, and how we get to the monetary position in which we are. To solidify this in actual, practical, proven theory, Karl Marx, the famous writer of Rich People Bad When They Steal Money From You and How to Get Money Back from Bad Rich People, defined the working class as those who must sell their ability to work for a wage and have no access to the ability to produce their own life's necessities for themselves. And the capitalist class as anyone who holds economic control over the workplaces, has political power, dictates the terms of others' working condition, or owns capital that is invested in production. Capitalism has converted the physician, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science into its paid wage laborers. Our relationship with the workplace is what defines our class. But what does that actually mean? In the simplest of terms, almost all jobs can be split between the exploited and the exploiter. The exploited usually owns nothing in his workplace and is allowed usage of their desk, factory machine, classroom, or surgical gear by the owners. In exchange for the usage of the workplace, the owner gets to decide how much who gets paid and even if they get paid at all. This is what makes them the exploiter, and in our conversation, not a member of the working class, as their wage is not earned through work, but through ownership. Therefore, a relationship to work and reimbursement for said work is what should be seen as the guiding factor to a class identity, and most importantly, class consciousness. But YUGOPNIK, you can't be telling me these filthy uneducateds are my supposed class allies. Yeah, mate, what the fuck am I supposed to do with these fucking bicycle-riding vegan hippies? There is no room for the fetishization of any lifestyle, and while the rural miner might not have a lot in common with the downtown programmer, there is far more common interest to be found in our unity than there is in our cultural disagreements. Class identity is not something which should replace everything else, but quite beautifully it should be seen as a tool for underpinning brotherhood and sisterhood among all creeds, races, religions, or genders. It is our class which inherently unifies us, as it places us both as the builders of civilization and the slaves of capital. Class identity holds such incredible power because it is instilled in cold material truth, in the scientific vision of the relations between humans, and most beautifully, it does not insinuate or imply that anyone, anywhere, cannot be a member as long as their wealth is earned through their own work. This, my dear Tavarishi, is why division has always and will always be the strongest tool at the disposal of capital. And what is the middle class, if not just that? A term used to introduce the idea that the interests of a wealthier laborer and a poorer one are not aligned. A term crafted to teach us, as it did me, that we are somehow better than some other fellow workers only because we have to lick the boot 5 times a day instead of 15. And while the majority of my criticism here is directed towards those who identify themselves as middle class, the wealthier laborers, there is criticism to be given to the misleading anti-elitism rural workers have towards urban ones. It is as important to state that division in the form of middle class identity comes both from up down but also from bottom up, usually as a reaction to having experienced ill treatment by more privileged workers who are a bit too far up their, dupe. Therefore, in the words of historian Geoffrey de Croix, wealth and poverty do not determine class, rather, they are manifestations of it. The idea of a middle class sets a dangerous precedent. This wouldn't be a YUGOPNIK video if you didn't get to hear from our favorite Slovenian sex god, Slavoj Žižek. In one of his most underrated talks, he breaks down a business idea that the construction of binary gender, which is both scientifically and ethically responsible and objectively correct, should be somehow applied to class, and that the binary notion of capitalists and workers should be disbanded for something a bit more complex.
Even attempted to say, no, there are not only capitalists and proletarians, but there is a multiplicity of positions which cannot be reduced to this binary. And what I tried to do in my absolutely evil way is to establish a kind of a list of this class multitude, like what if we have by class, like by gender, by class position, a proletarian sub-employing and exploiting other proletarians. Masturbatory cross-class, a small company self-employed owner exploiting himself. Class queen, a motherly capitalist who takes care of her workers but tolerates no trade unions. Then you have PTC, proletarian to capitalist. CTP, capitalist to proletarian, class bender, class queer, pan class, non-class, trans class, A class, third class, class fluid, non-binary trans class, class gifted. Then you have my favorite. You know, one in this list provided by New York City authorities of 31 identities, one is two-spirit. I don't know if it holds for sex, it certainly holds for capitalists. Aren't people like George Soros or Bill Gates two-spirit capitalists? Half-time, ruthless manipulators, one spirit, then the other half of the time, the most generous humanitarians, and so on. It's two-spirit. Then we have precarious proletarian, digital capitalist, CEC butch, a capitalist brutally exploiting another capitalist. As they say in Mikado, Gilbert and Sullivan, my favorite opera, they are all on the list and none of them will be missed. Why? And here comes another thing. I totally support and understand LGBT people when they claim that, when they demand for themselves the right how they are referred to. I just claim that I don't accept this as a general universal principles. It holds for sexuality, but I definitely am not ready to concede this as a general principle. We all have right to be called the way we want so that we will not be hurt. I mean, to give you an extreme example, take somebody like Hitler. No, she should be called dirty criminal, monster. He should be called precisely so that it will hurt as much as possible, and so on.
And while Žižek and myself obviously do believe that the fundamental right of being identified as what you want to be identified as absolutely should apply in the terms of sexuality, the idea that your personal preference can be applied to things such as class is absolutely absurd. The dissolvement of binary class identity serves only the capitalist as the dominant class because they do not need solidarity in order to preserve their spot in the wider economic and social hierarchy. Just consider how many people take the wording of middle class literally and believe that the majority of the wealth of any society is concentrated there. And now imagine introducing 50 other class identities. I mean, it's already hard enough to determine who's on whose side the way it is. Oh, and just in case someone still thinks that the majority of wealth is owned by the so-called middle class, here's a bunch of graphs.
Look at this graph.
Again, the idea of middle-class identity could serve as a dangerous springboard for many other industry-specific classes and in turn could even further split the already confused proletariat. So trust me, Mike the DJ who bought that Mercedes on lease isn't your class antagonist. It's the guy who can buy countries without a lease. What about the managers?
Is it just about the money, or do you have a dumb life's mission so you can pretend you came close to making any fucking difference at all? Jobs.
Paul Morrin already made a great video debunking the quasi-Marxist idea of PMCs, or the professional managerial class, which I'll link below. There, he very eloquently notes that Marx himself specified that different types of labor, be it physical, office, or managerial work, are still working class as long as they are not the owners of what today we call a business. It is incredibly important to note, though, that while still members of the working class, there are increasingly many middle and higher managers who are given higher incentives to side with their superiors instead of with their colleagues. When this occurs, and you have cutthroat HR departments or financial and legal professionals whose whole career is built around designing models for their CEOs on how to minimize labor cost and maximize productivity, you still have working class people, but working class traders, and simply calling them the middle class or the professional managerial class would be to clean their hands of what they are, treasonous lowlife, which choose the life of a rat, and which should be treated as such. But also, never forget who you are next time you get a promotion. Maybe you don't have to report Joey for fucking up 7 mochachinos today, or Maria for making a 2-digit error in her monthly financial report. While there are certainly members of the working class who have gained a lot more privilege than others through wealth accumulation, we must remember that we are in this together, and the sooner we realize it, the easier we will make our lives for each other in capitalism and after. Class cares about facts, not your feelings. Sure, the only argument that could be made for the existence of a middle class is what the power couple Marx and Engels would call the petit bourgeois. Think of them as small business owners, your local bakery or the hairstylist that owns his own shop, maybe even the doctor or lawyer with their own practice. But as COVID has shown us, small to medium business is not just losing ground, it's being totally annihilated by massive corporations which operate with far more sophisticated methods than your mom and pop shop could ever imagine even existed. So, even in a world where the middle class was to be identified as the Marxist notion of the petit bourgeois, fact is that they are still, on the daily, being proletarianized and absorbed back into the warm embrace of the workers. And to address those who still refuse to accept that even after lifting themselves up from whatever point they were in life to a better standing, if you are not the owner of capital but work for capital, you, my friend, are still one of us. Because no matter how much Biden or Trump talk about middle-class America, or how the European Union wants to build a bastion for so-called middle-class families, class does not care about your feelings. You have far more in common with a worker from the furthest industry than yours than you have with your closest corporate overlord. And the more of us understand that, the closer we are to embracing our big international family and creating class consciousness. Building class consciousness. Class struggle is the fundamental relationship between classes. It might sound like a scary word, but it isn't. It's simply reality. Every day a worker clocks in, his relationship to both his labor and the owner of his workplace is one of conflict. Because for one to profit, the other has to be given less than the value of what they produce. And it is in this class conflict that the relationship is established on who exploits who and to what extent. Asking for a raise is class conflict, unionizing is class conflict, and protesting workers' rights is class conflict because the struggle for being exploited less is the only one we are allowed to engage in within capitalism. But to engage in class struggle, you must first understand your class. You must embrace the fundamental relationship between exploitation and resistance, and through that you may gain class consciousness. But it is impossible as long as we divide ourselves between blue, white, yellow, pink, and blue-collared workers. Between imaginary classes telling us that our material interests do not co-align, telling us that we are to be happy with progress only in the social sphere of life, but not in that of the pursuit of bread. This does not mean, though, that there are no objective divisional categories inside of the working class created through reactionary sentiments such as racism, sexism, xenophobia, and transphobia, and those must be addressed adequately if we are to build a more just society. There is no discussion there. And class, as I mentioned before, should be used as a glue to tie together all groups within the wider frame of the working class under a common interest, which we genuinely share, and common foe, which we must overcome. Many people on the left love engaging in divisional discussion. And while I have nothing against sticking to your principles, hell, I'd encourage it, the first objective of building any possibility of a greater world where simply clocking in and clocking out and consuming isn't the be-all, end-all, comes from a sense of a unitary goal, of a vision based on shared struggle and shared purpose. And while reactionaries will find that in race and culture and conflict, I, for one, dear Tavarishi, dare us to look at something far more sublime. Struggle. The struggle to stay employed, to even find a job, to keep your flat, to pay that mortgage, to pay off that student loan, to have bread on the table. It is in shared struggle that we can understand just how similar we are, just how hungry we are, and just what needs to be done. Love your fellow worker and those struggling to find work, because if we don't have each other's backs, then who jebeno will? Tell that little kid inside of you that thinks they're better than another working class family only because they don't have to get their hands as muddy, to shut the fuck up. Thank you for watching Tavarishi, and speaking of struggle, if you like the message this channel tries to send, consider spending the price of half of a can of beer a month to support it via Patreon or PayPal, link below. Now, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank our badass patrons. And special gratitude goes out to Deep Red Wine, a bowl of creamy potato soup, Nathan Moore, Crouton and Baguette, Achichi, Desmond, Marussia Asarabakara, Neil Surio, Sem and Eggs. Have a good one, Tavarishi.
La stagione, rivoluzione, trionferà. Bandiera rossa deve trionfare, bandiera rossa deve trionfare.